This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, I'll be speaking with Dr. Joseph Shrand, aka Dr. Joe, about his theories on life and respect. Dr. Joseph Shrand is my guest. He is a radio host in Boston, and he has, over the years, developed his ideas about theories of respect and how people deal with each other. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about who he is, what he does. So, Joe, and I'll call you Dr. Joe, that's fine?
That's great, Dan.
So, uh, let's talk a little bit about your childhood. You grew up in the Boston area. Were your parents, in doctors? Were they medicine? Were they psychiatrists? What was your family background like?
So my father was a pediatrician and my mother was an actress, Frances Shrand of The Spider's Web, which was a WGBH PBS radio show that I actually helped get her on because I was on it first. But so those are the only two things I was gonna know how to do, was either be a physician or be an actor, and luckily I've been able to combine both.
So let's then get the elephant in the room. You were one of the child stars of a PBS television show that probably, people our age will remember, but people under the age of 40 probably have never heard of, although they may have heard of the reboot around the turn of the century. You were on the first season, and you were, I think you were the first child that was introduced in that. So just a little bit of background about how you got into that and how this has affected your views on human interactions as they go on.
Sure. Well, you didn't even mention what show it was, Dan.
Oh,
Can
I
you
did.
still sing the
Zoom.
theme
And
song?
we're on
Sing it.
Zoom.
There we go. We are on Zoom. Do you remember the theme song
Yeah,
at
we're
all?
gonna zoom. Don't. I want to talk about zoom, 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 zoom.
Yeah, there you go.
And I
Right.
remember, I remember
Oh,
Bernadette with the arm thing, and
right. That's right. Oh, 2, 1, 3, 4.
yeah,
So yeah, Zoom was, I think, revolutionized children's television. Sesame Street was around, Electric Company was around, the Mickey Mouse Club was around, all those other sort of shows. But Zoom was the first real TV show for kids and by kids. There were no adults on the show at all.
Mhm.
Um, I started on Zoom because I had been in a touring production of Oliver, and I played the Artful Dodger. I I don't know if you guys know, I was born in Cape Town, South Africa, went over to England and America, back and forth between those three countries for the first 9 or 10 years of my life, and wound up here in the Boston area. My mother was already doing theater, and she saw a flyer for an audition for Oliver, and so I auditioned, and I got the part of the Artful Dodger.
Mhm.
So my friends would come and see me in the musical. Um, One of my friends wound up hearing through his mother about these auditions for this new children's TV show that was sort of, the rumor was it would be like a Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In.
Mm.
Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In was a big, big show at that time,
Yeah, sock
back in
it
the
to me.
early 70s. That's right. And so Timmy and I, we went and auditioned. Um, there was a British guy who was turned out to be the executive producer, Christopher Sarson. Timmy and I had written this terrible play about Sherlock Holmes, and the whole theme was around Sherlock Holmes saying, "Please don't call me Shirley," which predates. I understand people took that line from us a long time later. I think an airplane.
Yeah.
But we did this play, it was terrible. And then this British guy said, "Can either of you sing?" And Timmy had seen me in Oliver, so he said, "Joe can sing." So they separated us. And I go and sing, the song, and I start doing some improv. And the next thing I know, that night I'm getting a phone call from this guy, Christopher Sarson. And he says, "Would you come back for the callbacks?" So the second round of auditions. So I said, "Sure." I called my friend up and said, "So whose mom is going to drive?" And he said, "Drive where?" Because he did not get a call back.
Mm.
And this taught me, Dan, my very first lesson in theater. never bring your friend to an audition.
Mhm.
So, with that in mind, I did the callbacks. There were about 20 kids or so who'd been called back. We did 2 days worth of working together and improvising and singing and dancing. And I got a phone call asking if I would be on the show. And that was the pilot of Zoom. And
In a bit of foreshadowing that I might want to engage in, so Zoom was amongst a number of shows in the early 70s that dealt with the emotional side of childhood. Uh, Shows before that in the 50s, like the Mickey Mouse Club or other kinds of local television shows, were the Peanut Gallery, Howdy Doody and whatnot. And then you had in the late 60s, you had sort of the rise of 1960s animation, especially on Saturday mornings. And you'd have an occasional gem like Schoolhouse Rock, but most of it was just fluff for the mind. A show like Zoom, and a few years later, a show like The Big Blue Marble, shows like in New York, there was the Magic Garden. In L.A., there was the New Zoo Review. I think Chicago had something called the Patchwork Family. I remember seeing, and these were all shows that focused on who the children, either the audience or the occasional kids on sets, were dealing with. What was in the zeitgeist that got the networks, or in a lot of these shows were syndicated too, and PBS, to actually want to focus on the interior of the child rather than what their exterior lives were like?
well, it's really interesting because I just recently went out to visit Christopher Sarson, who just turned 90
Mm.
in New Zealand. And he had invited me to come out there. And he showed me, I had never seen it before, a memo from basically the executives of WGBH. And they said, look, this sounds like a terrible show. Children are just boring.
Mm.
So we don't want to do it. Another show had some leftover money and they gave it to Christopher, and that's how we built it. So people were not interested in the inner workings of the child. The way that actually started was due to a complete accident on set. And what happened was we were rehearsing uh, the first dance number. So Zoom developed a theme, right? There'd be openings, but at the end of it, Billy Wilson, this amazing choreographer, um, and Newt Wayland, this amazing pianist and composer, would put together a song. And this was the sort of showstopper of every Zoom episode. During that rehearsal, one of the kids fell off the set, Tracy, and hit her head and had to be taken to the hospital. And we were totally blown away by it and devastated. And Christopher Sarson kept the cameras rolling as the six of us sat down together and processed what had happened. And that became the very first Zoom rap
Ah.
called Hospitals. And every kid has some hospital story. So that then developed another tradition, which was a Zoom rap, where we would talk with each other as kids about stuff that was going on in the world. So it was sort of serendipity. I mean, Tracy's fine, which is good. Um, but that was how the Zoom rats really started. And it was this idea that, you know what, kids have something to say as well. And kids are living in a world. And at that point, remember, the world, this was 1972. So Boston was in the midst of busing and the racial tensions that were going on in the United States. And we were part of that. We were a racially diverse and integrated group. And it was just remarkable because it was kids, it didn't matter what color you were and how tall you were and what gender you were. Kids were kids being kids, and that was what Zoom was about. And that's why it won 2 Emmy Awards, because it was really, I mean, it was novel, as you point out. Nobody was looking at that stuff.
It was interesting. A couple of months ago, when I first came across some of the videos regarding the 50th anniversary of the show, and got me wanting to do it again. About 4 or 5 years ago, I tried to contact some people, but I guess this was before the 50th anniversary. But I remember the song that sticks in my mind was "The Cat Came Back," but I could have sworn it was season three. I could have sworn that Laurie and the taller kid Danny. Apparently there were two Dannys. I think I only watched the first three seasons regularly, and then I guess got too old for it. But I that song always stuck with me because I think it's like an old hobo song or something from the late 19th century or whatnot. But then I saw it was the first season, and I was like, it's almost like 2001, where all the time mixes together in and out of the kids and what, and you think, oh, that was them, but no, it wasn't, and it was just very interesting to see, and there were a lot of other things too. They had the ubby language. They had kids filmed segments from kids, in Philadelphia or Seattle or in South America or wherever it was, and it was something that was picked up on. I remember by Big Blue Marble. I interviewed the creator of that show a few years ago, and they did some very similar things. Was the show more of a mission, or was it just sort of let's show these kids? Was there like a guiding light, if you will?
Well, the episodes, the pieces are the Zoom guest. So we always had a Zoom guest because there were so many interesting kids, and there were kids who were either, building rafts or doing other things. We had one kid who was blind, who was also, talking about their experience. The Zoom rap, which we just spoke about, the musical component. I don't think that we ever had that sort of vision in the moment. I think it was in retrospect realizing, whoa, 50 years later, people still remember what we did? Like, what was that? What had we tapped into in those kids in the 70s who were watching our show that they still remember it 50 years later, half a century? And I think what it was the honesty of it. And we were not professional actors. I mean, we were a bunch of kids. It could have been any kid from anywhere could be on Zoom. The first auditions were maybe, I don't know, 100 kids at the most, I'm sure. I think that's what Christopher said. The second season, though, everyone wanted to be on it. They knew about it. And remember, we also had the advantage back then that there were only like 4 TV stations, right? Yeah, it wasn't like you had millions and millions of choices like you do today. And this was a unique show. It was just so appealing because there was that honesty to it. It was just us being us.
So one of the other factors of the show was every year or every season there'd be a total or semi replacement of all the characters or all the actors, the kids. So you lasted what, maybe a year and a half, and then what happened?
So we realized that we did need to have a turnover of kids. I'm not saying that we realized the kids. Christopher Sarson and the rest of the grown-ups realized it. So at the end of the first season, it was decided that rather than make some selection based on popularity, the 4 oldest kids would graduate from the show and they would audition for 4 new kids. And after that, it became whoever the old kids were, not oldest, but the old cast would leave and the new cast would come in. So that was how the first group was terminated, if you will. I mean, we weren't really terminated, but so it was Tommy, Nina, myself, and John. So we were the 4 oldest, but by months, I mean, we were like 13, 14 years old. And so Tracy, Kenny, and Nancy stayed on to sort of ground the next season so there would be familiar faces and new faces. And then at the end of that season, Tracy, Nancy, and Kenny moved on, and there were three new kids, and that's how that first went on. And it was the Sarson 21. So that's what we call ourselves. Christopher Sarson was the executive producer for I think the first three seasons and 21 kids,
Mhm.
and we all considered him our Zoom papa. And when we had our 50th anniversary, it was here at our house, and Christopher came from New Zealand. Kids came from all over the country. Kids were in Texas and Carolinas and Massachusetts, everywhere. And it's as if we had seen each other the day before. We've all stayed in touch with each other. We had a 40th anniversary as well here. Um, but the 50th was really special because WGBH recognized that they had created something. And so they made a point of promoting it and putting it on and putting on the first show so that everybody could see it again.
What it reminded me of when I saw some of the 50th anniversary episodes, and I think there was only two or three, or maybe some, because they said they were going to have some later ones, but it seemed that only two or three that I could find. But it reminded me of the great Seven Up film series. If you've ever seen in Britain where they followed people after every 7 years, and now they're to 63 or 70. You, have you ever seen that?
No, but
Google it.
it's the
Google.
Seven Up series.
Yeah, Google it.
Okay.
It's called the Up series from age 7, 14, 21, 20 up to
Interesting.
63 when the first person died and also the filmmaker died. So we don't know if there's going to be a 70 up, but you definitely should check it out. You can probably find the episodes on YouTube. But
Seven Up, it just reminds me, Dan, of this guy who worked in the Seven Up factory, right? And he quit his job because his job was to crush cans,
mm,
but he quit. He said because it was so depressing. Soda
yeah, I get it.
depressing.
Um,
Thank you. Yeah,
uh,
appreciate the opportunity.
so, was there depression when you left the show, and then how many years? Because you would have been said 14 or so. So I guess you're in the last year of junior high or so, or middle school, what they call it now. And did you? What did you go back to doing theater at your high school, and then suddenly say, I'm never going to be Robert Redford or whatever?
Uh, I knew I would never be Robert Redford, but no, I wasn't depressed at all. I mean, as a matter of fact, it was a remarkable experience because all of a sudden I couldn't walk down the street without people, coming up and wanting my autograph. My mother actually, gave me the best advice, which was always treat people with respect because it may take enormous amount of courage to come up and ask you for an autograph.
Mm.
Um, I I was asked to audition for um, The King and I, which was being produced in South Shore and North Shore music theaters, and that got me my equity card.
Ah.
So I became a member of Equity, and I did theater on and off for the next almost 6, 7 years, 7, 8 years. Certainly
Did you
did it
have
in
to
high
shave your
school.
head for that Brunner look?
I did not. That was just Yul Brynner's look. But no, my hair was still out crazy. So I went to college to do theater. And there's actually an interesting side story to this. I auditioned for Juilliard, Carnegie Mellon, all the big theater schools, and I didn't get into any of them.
Mm.
And I wound up going to Sarah Lawrence, which was great. But years later, I found out that my mother, who had said to me, Joe, you can be whatever you want as long as it's a doctor, uh, she had spoken to the director of the theater department at my school and said to him, I don't want Joe going into this. So he wrote, unbeknownst to me, a letter basically giving me a C in theater instead of an A. So there was no theater school that was going to take me because of that. So it was fascinating that then propelled me to go to Sarah Lawrence. At Sarah Lawrence, I continued to do theater. I had We had wonderful theater there, but I got really interested in animal behavior.
Now, before you go on, can I just ask, when did you find out about this with your mother, and did it cause any tensions?
Yes, it's caused a bit of tension, but in retrospect, everything happens for a reason. I found out about it years later,
Uh,
along with something that I'll tell you, I just found out like 2 years ago.
mhm.
You want to hear that story?
Go ahead.
Great. Um, so a couple of years ago, my mother had passed, and was finally able to find some time to go through all of her old stuff. And I found this letter that was written to me when I was a freshman in college. So it would have been 1976. And it was a letter from a casting agent. And it said, "We've seen you in Zoom. We would love to have you cast as the son in Jaws 2." I then found another letter. My mother never gave it to me. She'd opened it, she never gave it to me. There was another letter from about 2 or 3 months later from the same casting agent saying, "We haven't heard back from you, but we're keeping the part open for you if you want it." And of course, I never knew about it.
Mm.
So fascinating that, I was recognized as an actor. I could have done it, and my mother didn't want me to do it. So that's not the path I took. When I graduated from college, I did have a theater company briefly, with some of my colleagues from Sarah Lawrence. But then I went to New York, did some theater, and then a different trajectory started.
It's funny you mentioned that because I remember in the mid to late '80s, my mom, I had just started becoming a writer, and I would write journal, diary stuff. I'm a terrible diarist, but uh, she would always check because I would be out late, either at my job or mischief or whatever it was, and she'd be and I forget how I found out that she was looking at my diary. So I just I I I would write false diary entries like if I was out till 3:30, I went to sleep at 10 a.m. or 10 p.m. woke up and that sort of quelled things. I guess my mother had tension or whatnot. But anyway, back to your ascent or your alternate path with the animals.
Yeah, so I got really interested in this thing called animal behavior, and um, this guy E.O. Wilson, who was a professor at Harvard, had
Uh,
just published this book called Sociobiology,
yeah,
which was looking at the genetics of behavior. I was totally enthralled by it.
yeah, he's
I'd
amazing from
read
an interview.
Darwin,
Yeah.
and so for my junior year, I went to Harvard to study with Wilson and his group.
Mm,
Um, and it absolutely influenced everything that I've done since then.
mm.
The idea that every organism is simply trying its best to survive. Might not get it right, but it will absolutely try to do its best. And that influenced what I think we'll probably talk about at some point, the I am approach.
Yeah. Just by the way, do you have an opinion about Jane Elliott and her brown eye, blue eye study?
Which one is that?
Oh, you know,
I'm not sure.
oh,
I read so many things.
oh,
I'm not sure I
Jane,
remember it. Go
Jane
ahead.
Elliott, she would bring kids in, and on day one she would say, "Well, the blue-eyed kids are superior. They're the better kids," and then a day or two later she'd reverse it. Then the blue-eyed kids were the lowest class, and this led to tensions. It brought things out. It's a very famous. She's had numerous documentaries made about it. This was in the late '60s, right around the time I guess you were getting your childhood acting career ready. But um, so, when did you sort of fully commit to this life? Was it with Wilson, studying with Wilson? Was that the final push?
Uh, no, the final push was around 1981, 1982. I'd graduated from college. I moved back to New York. I'd been doing some, way off Broadway theater. I was working as a writer for CARE, International Aid and Development Organization. And my job was a development analyst. And what I would do is analyze the overseas programs and then write up basically funding pitches that would go to different groups. I wrote one that Rotary International gave us a whole bunch of money for. It was a project in Belize called REAP, Rural Education Agricultural Program, where they were integrating all sorts of different things into the schools so the kids could grow their own crops, they could work with their parents. It was helping all these kids and their families in these very, very rural communities in Belize. And CARE sent me down there to report on it. And I realized while I was there that I was doing medicine, but wholesale for people I would never meet. And I decided I wanted to do it retail. I wanted to meet the people. So I had to redo all of my pre-med stuff. And that was 1982. And that's when I had to take physics. You still awake?
Yeah.
No, whenever I say physics, people immediately fall asleep and
Oh
tune
no,
out. But
no. I enjoy physics. We could talk about physics if you want. Go ahead.
But in physics, the symbol capital I stands for potential current. It's part of an equation for electricity.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought, what if we turn it upside down and we call it a current potential? And we look at everyone at a maximum current potential, doing the best they can at that moment in time with the potential to change in the very next second to another best they can. And that became the I am, which has absolutely influenced everything I've done since then. But it was based on the idea that Darwin had, which was that, an organism is going to try to adapt.
Mm-hmm.
They might not get it right. It changes the paradigm. I didn't realize at the time what I had actually done, which was to extend what was called the biopsychosocial model, which is still the dominant model now in medicine, and extend it by integrating what I realized later was something called theory of mind. And we'll come back to that. We can talk about it. But that was the pivot moment for me, was sitting there and just writing on a napkin in a bar in New York this equation, using some physics, some calculus, and thinking, what influences people? Who are we? And realizing that there are four things that influence us. Your home domain. No one's going to argue your home has had an influence on who you are. And that home certainly had influenced me. The social domain, which is everything other than the home. Everything else, being at school, walking down the street, everything. And you can appreciate stuff that happens at home influences things that happen in the rest of your life. And then I thought, well, there's got to be another domain, the biological domain of your brain and body, right? So you're influenced by your internal systems. Am I hungry? Am I tired? Am I digesting lunch? And then something I called the I see domain, which was your current concept of yourself. How do I see myself? But more importantly, how do I think other people see me? And that became the I am. At the time, it was called the IMAX. It was the IMAX equation. But when I went to publish a book, I got invited to write a book that involved the IMAX approach. We changed it to the I am, which I like actually better because it means this is who I am.
Yeah.
This is me.
So a few months ago, I stumbled across on YouTube a brief 6-minute video with Richard Bundy, the brother of Ted Bundy, and I've always had an interest in criminology because I grew up in a Goodfellas type area. And, there was the famous book by Ann Rule in the 80s that had a lot of misinformation. But hearing you talk about this, I wonder how does, and we'll talk more about the I am in a moment, but it seems that the whole thing is based upon the idea that, as you said, every creature is trying to do its best to survive. But when we get to the human level, there are malefactors. There are bad actors on the scene. The Ted Bundys, certain presidents, Timothy McVeighs and Bin Ladens and etc. Um, wouldn't that put a bit of a kibosh on some of the things? Because it sounds like the IM method is based upon the idea that we're all just trying to get along, and even if I do something that might, hurt you in some way, it's not my intent. But there are malefactors, are there not?
Yeah, no, I don't think it changes it at all.
No.
The IM is never saying that you have to like the IM or that you have to condone it or that you're not going to be held responsible for it. It's not a free ride. It doesn't even say that you're going to win and be successful. And for some people, success is when you love going to work and love going home. I hope that everybody can experience that. But for some people, success is having food in the refrigerator.
Mm-hmm.
For some people, success is having a home to have a refrigerator. For some people, success is just being able to wake up and get through the day. But instead of judging ourselves and other people as less than and broken, not doing as well as they can, should be doing better, less valuable, let's look again at why we do what we do based on the influence of these four domains. And think about these words, look again, and reverse them. Again, look. Again, to repeat something, look like a spectator. The I am is saying, let's respect why people do what they do without judging them. When is the last time you got angry at someone treating you with respect?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that point. One of the things, the quote that stood out to me was you said on your website, you control no one but influence everyone. So I'm someone who is a non-determinist. I don't believe in determinism. I believe that we have free will and whatnot. Does the I am account, or is it predicated on the notion of free will?
Oh, sure. Yeah, you get to choose. Again, the I am is saying that you don't always get it right. But let's look again at why we're doing it. Respect is what everybody wants, but respect leads to value, which is what everybody really wants. Think about every person you've ever met in your life. They just want to feel valued by somebody else. For millennia, human beings have increased their value by decreasing somebody else's. And then are astonished that that other person, that other group, that other country does the same. That is why we have the conflicts we have today. But instead of judging those people and mirroring what they do, let's wonder why they do that based on their I am. What's going on that the best of Bin Laden could do was what he did? What was going on in his home domain, his social domain? The way he saw himself, the way he thought other people saw him, the way his biological domain worked. Remember, you're right. The second truth of the I am is what you said. You control no one, you influence everyone. You get to choose the kind of influence you want to be. And we know that because everyone is interested in what you think or feel about them. And it feels different in your biological domain when you feel respected or disrespected. You're part of someone's home or social domain. You control no one, you influence everyone. The first truth is that small changes can have big effects. You don't need to change everything. As a psychiatrist, when I add a medication, all my patients learn the I am. But I explain to them, this medicine that we're adding is making a small change in your biological domain. We change the environment of the cells, we change their response. Nothing is broken. Right? The cells are doing the best they can given the environment that they're in. You change the environment, you change the response. So is that free will? Absolutely. Is it determinism? I don't think so, because we always have these choices. In my latest book called Unleashing the Power of Respect, I actually address that question of free will in one of the chapters on a patient of mine who had obsessive compulsive. And the question was, with the obsessive compulsive behaviors, did he still have free will? Of course. Of course. And as he began to manage this and recognize it and learn what was going on, began to change his behaviors. Granted, we added some medication as well, but it was small changes in the domains. And it turned out, not to be a spoiler, but at the end of the story, he began telling me of memory about a kindergarten teacher who was very angry with him if he didn't color within the lines. He wasn't allowed to go outside the lines, and he wanted to please her. And that may have propelled into obsessive compulsive in some way.
So let me ask, because, I mean, as I said, I've known a lot of people, not people who are as well known as a Bundy or a Timothy McVeigh or whatnot. McVeigh has his political theories that, he claimed made him do what he did. Bundy famously or infamously claimed pornography made him do it at the end, which is probably just another little way to flip off society before he was gone. Bin Laden with religion, and you can, whatever drives a pedophile or whatnot. But if you get some of these people who, their only way they can feel respected is disrespecting someone else, doesn't that pervert the whole idea of the I am? Again, doesn't that just, it would work for maybe you, it would work for me, it would work for 99.99% of people out there. But there are some people that it would seem, and I'm not talking about irredeemable evil, but that are just broken beyond salvation in a sense.
But you see, that mirrors what they're doing. So what you have just done is discard them in the same way that they've discarded other people. We have these mirror neurons in our brain that mirror each other. I'm not condoning these things, but I actually write about that also in Unleashing the Power of Respect in a chapter called Roses, about a little boy who was doing the best he could, but was basically poisoning people. And the I am perspective is on crime. If you think about crime and our entire legal system, it really is based on one person devaluing another person and then being held accountable for that. Think about every single crime, whether it's economic or social or the crimes of Ted Bundy. And I give a talk on this. The I am is not judgmental. The I am isn't saying, here are the goods, here are the bads. It's saying, here it is. What was going on in this person's life that the best they could do was kill other people? I'm not condoning it at all. But I'm not going to kill them for it. I'm going to try to understand it so that maybe there's a small change we can make. Maybe we can learn something so that we don't repeat that somewhere else. Look, human beings are organisms like any other. What's the main thing that we do? We compete. I need to survive. This goes back millions and millions of years. It saddens me in some ways that we still do that because we don't have the same sort of limited resources. We have terrible distribution of resources, but the resources themselves are not as limited as they were when we were evolving. But this is why value is so important, because millions of years ago, we were not the biggest animal. We weren't the fastest. We weren't the strongest. We were isolated mammals scurrying around, hoping not to be lunch. We were the prey. And then we formed these social groups, and our survival potential increased so dramatically, human beings are everywhere. But to access the protection of the group, you must contribute to the group, which means you must have value. So when we perceive through that I see domain, how do other people see me, that they see me with less value, it can activate our limbic fight, flight, freeze response, and we can go primal. But then you can step back and say, well, what's going on? How come the only way that person can feel valuable is to make me feel less valuable? What's going on in their I am? What happened in their home or social domain? What's happening in their biological or IC domain? I don't need to mirror and repeat what they do. I can step back and wonder about it instead of worry about it. I can be reflective about it instead of reflexive about it. So there are people in the world who do not respect other people, but that's their I am. Let's try to understand that instead of disrespecting them and isolating them.
Well, I mean, I'm not saying that what you're saying about, for example, I did a show a couple of years ago about the need for forgiveness in the justice system. A few months ago, I interviewed a fellow who was a former intern, a medical intern, who was stealing drugs, spent 3 years in prison, and talking about how society doesn't give people like that a chance. So I'm all for that forgiveness, but how do you get this rational viewpoint to the person who is the Bundy or the McVeigh? Um, you know, putting us. I mean, I can understand that, and I can say, if this fellow who I interviewed, Smiles for Miles, if you want to look up, that's his organization or his YouTube channel. I have no problem if I was an employer hiring someone and giving them a second chance. But how do you get inside the person who is, the I am is not, it has cracks?
Well, you may not be able to.
Uh-huh.
I mean, the I am is not an immunization against bad things.
Uh-huh.
What it's trying to do is say, let's understand it. We absolutely need, a criminal justice system because some people cannot be safely in a social environment without doing exactly what we don't want them to do, which is to hurt other people. It is, unfortunately, very difficult. And this is where my forensic colleagues may have more to add to it. But the crime is to abandon those people. We may never be able to change them. You know?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we can't have the hope.
So does this work above the individual level? Can you upscale it fractally to a social level? And if so, can you explain that?
Absolutely. The I am is not just about an individual level. Remember, we start off as a cell. So a cell has an I am. The collection of cells is the person. The organism has an I am. But absolutely a society has an I am. The United States has its home domain, which is the United States. It has its social domain, which is the interaction with the rest of the world. It has its IC domain, the way it sees itself and the way other nations see it, which is different under George Washington than it is under presidents. And then the United States has its biological domain, all of its resources, all of its people, and each of them is an I am. So absolutely, you can elevate the I am approach to a social system. The universe has an I am, right? Everything. But shifting the paradigm is really important to say it's doing the best it can, but if we don't like it, we can change it. We're not hopeless. We're not helpless. We're not worthless. But we can't change something unless you know why it's happening. I mean, that's one thing that I've really learned in medicine. The diagnosis is critical to the next intervention. If I don't understand what's happening with someone, I can give them a medicine that could make it worse. And sometimes that happens, right? But that's what the I am is about. Let's step back. What if there is no sickness? There is no pathology. It doesn't mean that we have to like everything. It doesn't mean we condone it. But why are there so many angry, stressed out people in the world right now? What is going on with them that they don't feel valued and they want to change that? And is there a way for us to say, look, you're valuable. It doesn't mean that you now have to devalue somebody else, but there's a biological component to it. Right? There's a neurochemical called cortisol. Cortisol is a neurohormone of stress. It's been around for millions and millions of years. When you're under stress, cortisol is released and activates your body. It's actually chemical from the brain, adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, recognizes there's a danger, it sends a message down to the adrenal glands, like adrenaline on top of the kidneys, they release cortisol, and you activate to run away or fight that saber-toothed tiger. All sorts of things in your body happen. But what cortisol also does is interfere with another neurochemical called dopamine. Dopamine, all drugs and alcohol force the brain to make dopamine. Dopamine is a neurohormone of pleasure. Very difficult to feel any pleasure when you're under stress. Cortisol also interferes with oxytocin, not OxyContin, oxytocin, which is a neurohormone of trust and happiness. It's very difficult to feel trust when you're under stress. But that's our biology. Once you recognize, oh, I understand what's happening here. The stress I'm experiencing is because I think on some level I'm being devalued. If I'm devalued, I'm going to be kicked out of my protective group. But let me recognize it. Why is going on with the person that the best they can do is to devalue me? So it really is a way to shift yourself from that limbic fight, flight, freeze response to this new modern part of our brain, your prefrontal cortex, right behind your forehead, responsible for thinking, analyzing, solving problems, executing plans. It happens to be where theory of mind lives, where we can appreciate and try to understand what somebody else is thinking or feeling and what they think or feel about us.
Well, let me ask you this. I've often argued with people. I think one of the most corrosive things in human societies is what I call the PELF model of economy, in that we value things only as money, as things, not accomplishments, not in work done. One of the things, and I'm repeating myself for people who know me, is that I hate when I hear parents say, all I want is for my child to be happy. And I'm like, how about your child live a valuable life? Happiness comes and goes. It's an ephemeral thing. Do things of value. Be the best that you can be. But we all put things down to, oh, he makes $25,000 a year working part-time as a janitor. He's inherently not as good as so-and-so, the dean of the school. And maybe the dean of the school does know more and has studied more and whatnot. But when we get down to this, what I call the PELF model of dealing with things, I'm wondering then, if we look at the Confederate States of America, everything was about having the power over other people because of a financial incentive. Where if we're talking about Lebensraum, we want the Slavs' land because and the Russians' land because we want to make money from it. Nowadays, with certain billionaires that are going around, they just want more and more and more. So, what do you think that is there an economic component? Do you think that the way that we run the world in terms of everything being devalued to how many things we have, is that sort of like a cancer that to the I am thought of how to approach life?
Well, I mean, what you're saying is absolutely true, right? There is this sense that your monetary value is the, no pun intended, the bottom line. But this goes back evolutionarily, right? It was incredibly important to be able to get mangoes. The more mangoes you had, the safer you were going to be because you had something to eat, right? And then to be able to hunt as a group, but somebody was going to be in charge of that group. So this idea of possessions absolutely has permeated every single culture that we have. And it has created these hierarchies, but that's still an I am. What can we do? What can we learn from that? We perpetuate it a lot, right? We have people who earn more money than other people. And I'm not, saying we need to have a socialist or communist society. We need to understand this. But at any and every moment, you can remind someone of their value. And whenever you remind someone of their value, you increase your own value. See, it's not just about the money in that way. We do it in small ways every day. You open a door for someone, or you hold the door open when they're coming out of a store with, you know, their arms full of stuff. What does that person say? They say, thank you. And what does the other person say in return 90% of the time?
You're welcome.
You're welcome. Exactly. What does that mean? It means you're part of my group. You're welcome. You're part of my group. You don't need to compete against me. As soon as you say thank you to someone, you recognize that they are a benefactor. They have done something, given something of themselves to you, even if it may seem as insignificant as opening a door. The opening a door indicates that they recognized you and they noticed that you needed some assistance and they did it. That's who we are as human beings. The problem is sometimes we confine that to one group. I will only help people in my group, and every other group, they're on their own, or worse, I'm going to try to take from them. But you know what I'm realizing just within the last year or so? The dehumanization of one group of another. We see that, right? I can do this thing because they're not even human. We did that in the United States. We're doing that all over. Do you realize that we can reframe that in a really positive way? That the only way one human being can hurt another human being is to dehumanize them? And say the only way I can hurt you is if you're not human. Because if you're human, you're part of my group. And the more people I have in my group, the safer I am. So what have we done? We've dehumanized other people so that we can hurt them and take from them without feeling that guilt and shame of doing it to someone that we care about. Shame is a whole nother component of who we are as human beings. And the reframe of shame is you wouldn't feel ashamed if you didn't care.
But let me ask you this. This goes to the heart of the human as the social animal, because in a sense, tribalism made sense early on. You know, if there's the rock people and the river people, and the rock people want to take more water from the river than the river people, that'll kill them off. There's going to be that conflict, that loggerheads. So how do you switch from something that in the misty past was actually a benefit, because I had my uncles, I had my nephews, I had my brothers, and they could help us against the saber-tooths. They can also help us against the rock people. So how do, at some point in the evolution of society, you know, what was once a boon became a bane?
Yeah. And that's exactly right. But remember, we have this prefrontal cortex now. The prefrontal cortex, one of the responsibilities is anticipating the future. What will happen next if we do this now? If we remain limbic, in this limbic primal fight, flight, freeze response, what will happen next? We will destroy ourselves. That is what will happen. We now, as E.O. Wilson said, you know, we are caveman mentality with Star Wars weapons. I mean, we could destroy ourselves. That is really scary. But if fear shuts us down, we're not going to be able to do anything. There is enough to go around. But there are people, as you say, who don't believe that, who think the only way that they can be safe or valuable is to take someone else, like the rock people taking the water. But if you get those rock people on board, now you've got even more people to fight that saber-toothed tiger. Now you have even more people. The problem that we've had all along, and it's so important to recognize, is we always need to have some sort of common enemy to come together as a group, right? I mean, H.G. Wells with War of the Worlds, this was the theme. The whole world came together to fight an alien world. I wish that we didn't have to do that. I wish that we could just come together because we're one group. It's called humanity. We don't always need to have an enemy for us to rally around. Let's take a look at something else.
Yeah. Yeah, because you're just displacing or replacing one enemy with another by doing so. Um, but uh, let's take an example of like global warming. There is no big bad necessarily. I mean, there isn't the rock people and the river people. I mean, there are people who either through sheer ignorance or their little world isn't going to be as affected as much as the rock people, today's rock people. Uh, so let's not care about that. I, the, I guess I'm just, how do you get through? You can have all the respect in the world, but at some point, when someone keeps telling you that, you know, these people are inferior or the earth is flat, and despite you could take them up an aeroplane and show them the curve of the world, you know, how do you get through there if people don't even respect their own ability to transcend their limits?
See, I think that the global warming and environmental crisis is the opportunity for us to come together, not to fight something, but to heal something. We have an opportunity as a global community to work together to keep our planet safe so that we have a place to stay. How do we get through to people? We may not be able to. I mean, look, my last name is Shrand. I get Shrandiose, it's true, but there are limits to it. It doesn't mean it's not an I am. The reason the I am approach is potentially so powerful is because it changes the paradigm. Instead of my mirroring other people's disdain, I'm going to step back and try to understand why they are disdainful. Why are they doing that? And once I let them know that I'm really interested in who they are, it's remarkable how many people just go, well, you mean you're not going to like just do what I'm doing? Now, remember, I work in the world of psychiatry, where every single person, I really believe every person who comes to see someone like me on some level feels less valuable. And I have the remarkable privilege and opportunity of simply reminding them of their value.
Well,
That needs them to be able to explore these secrets of themselves.
are they feeling less valuable in comparison to you or someone else that's real, or are they feeling less valuable to some mythic conception of their own self?
Oh, well, those. I don't think it's me. I think that we are in this potential power differential as the physician or the person on the other side of the chair. But I teach people that we need to be aware of that and not let that be the dominant model, right? So absolutely, people come in and they worry that we're going to judge them, right? That we have this power over them. Um, I'm just honored that they're coming in to chat with me and to explore. So I do think that there are people in the world that I've worked with who started off feeling angry and dismissive and isolated and mistrustful. Um, and they learn the I am.
So how do you then uh, how do you get a wider audience for that? Other than, I mean, you can write a book, you can give a lecture, you can do a YouTube video that maybe goes viral, uh, but how do you get sort of into the corridors of power? Because ultimately speaking, if we're talking on the non-individual level, if we're talking on the societal level, we you have to get some of the movers and shakers in power to understand certain things. How do you bridge that gap?
Well, that's what I'm hoping you'll do, Dan. Right? You just broadcast this interview everywhere, and we'll get people to start changing one by one. In terms of really answering your question, I mean, I'm very fortunate that more and more people are starting to listen to this,
Mm-hmm.
and more people are wondering, well, why are we continuing to do things the way we're doing them? We will destroy ourselves. Uh, so, I'm just a guy down here, but there are people who are starting to listen. Um, but I am very fortunate in that people are starting to listen. Part of the way we're getting the message out there is certainly the books, the podcasts that I have. I blog every now and then on Psychology Today, um, Drug Story Theater, which we may have a chance to talk about. But what's really sort of been fun is that people actually beginning to trust. Maybe this guy has something to say. Maybe he's not just some, long-haired quack old psychiatrist.
Well,
Because it resonates with people. Because they when I say to them, look, when is the last time you got angry at someone treating you with respect? And they think, my God, never. Or we all want the same thing, which is just to feel valued. Think about every person you've ever met and you go, whoa, you're right. This is not, you know, concepts that are so out there, like quantum mechanics. This is tapping into who we are as human beings. And every human being wants it. If we can just get that message out that it's okay for you to care for people outside your group because we are one group.
so, Dr. Joe, let's just talk a few minutes before we end about some of the other aspects. We got so engrossed in that talk. Drug Story Theater. Explain to me what that is and how it came about.
So, Drugs Free Theater, we take teenagers in the early stages of recovery from drugs and alcohol. We teach them improvisational theater. And then we use something called psychodrama, and they create their own scripted shows about the seduction of, addiction to, and recovery from drugs and alcohol. And they perform those shows for middle schools and high schools, so the treatment of one becomes the prevention of many. That's our slogan. The treatment of one becomes the prevention of many. But in between each scene of the show, the kids step out of character and they do PowerPoint presentations teaching the audience about the neuroscience of adolescent brain development and why their brain is at such risk for addiction. All the kids in the audience take a pre and post show neuroscience quiz, and we can measure how kids who learn about their brain change their perception. Not trying to scare anyone. Scaring has never worked. If the brain is going to choose between fear and pleasure, it's going to choose pleasure every time. But what Drugs Free Theater is saying is, look, you've got choices. This is what's going on in your brain. Not your fault, nothing to do with your socioeconomic status, your religion, your creed. It's just brain development. And just because of the way your brain is developing as a teenager, you're at more risk for lifelong addiction. So the kids put up these numbers, they put up, images of the brain and they explain it. So one of the things to say is, and this is true based on data, if you start using drugs or alcohol after the age of 21, 1 out of 25 people are at risk for lifelong addiction. If you start using before the age of 18, and all the kids on the stage say, I did, I did, I did, I did. If you start using before the age of 18, that number goes from 1 in 25 to, we put up a slide that says, guess here. And the audience of 6th, 7th, 8th graders, 9th, and seniors in high school, college, they start guessing. So Dan, what's your guess? If you start using after the age of 21, it's 1 in 25 people are at risk for lifelong addiction. If you start using before the age of 18, that number goes from 1 in 25 to 1 in what?
3.
1 in 4.
I'm a pessimist.
Yeah, that reminds me. The pessimist was talking to an optimist. Did you ever hear that? And the pessimist says, oh, things cannot get any worse. And the optimist says, yes, they can. So 1 in 4, simply the way your brain is developing. So we'll have an audience of 800 kids who's watch a Drug Story Theater show. And after the show, there's a talkback. We'll have 200 kids stand up. We'll say, that's how many are at risk. just because of the way your brain is developing. Your limbic system, the emotional, irrational, pleasure-seeking part of your brain, is more in control and more myelinated, which is a way of measuring maturation. It's more in control than the prefrontal cortex. And the kids on stage go, oh, so I could get high without thinking about the future. And that's what it is. And all drugs and alcohol force the brain to make dopamine. This is also what we teach the kids. Dopamine interferes with oxytocin, not OxyContin, oxytocin. Remember, oxytocin is the neurohormone of trust. So you can get high, but the price you pay is trust. So our kids have now written several shows looking at the peer pressure that got them going, the traumas and their ACEs, adverse childhood experiences that had them use that first time. We're looking and using a lot of shows right now looking at Narcan and trying to promote Narcan because of the fentanyl crisis that's going on. And we've got kids now who are writing shows about, and it's always about their own experience that we then can form into plays, but the neuroscience is relatively the same. But we talk about, in some shows, dopamine and oxytocin. In others, we talk about cortisol and the stress response. We're now just writing a show now that's looking at fentanyl overdoses and how that happens in the brain. We're looking at just creating a show right now looking at ecstasy and date rape and what happens there and how the MDMA increases increases dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin. So you feel this pleasure, but also this trust that can really be exploited. All of those are IMs. Even the person who's doing the exploitation is at an IM, but they will be held responsible for that because you've hurt and tried to devalue somebody else.
Yeah, it's interesting.
That's what Drug Story Theater is.
Yeah.
We have a bunch of shows. We have a website, drugstorytheater.org, and that's theater with an ER because so many of our kids wind up there. And it's been incredible. We've had some of our kids have been with us for 10 years. You know, they're not kids anymore, but they're living their lives. They're not addicted to drugs and alcohol. They are, you know, they can have a drink every now and then or do something, but it's not running their lives like it was when I first met them.
Yeah, I had a friend who died a couple of years ago, and he recently had a documentary made on his life. He had addictions to drugs, alcohol. He was then in a car accident, had a traumatic brain injury. He ended up homeless in jail, and then he spent the last 40 years of his life turned it around. He wrote one great novel. He wrote some great poetry, and he worked for his church. He went to missions in India, in Haiti, and one of the maybe Ethiopia it was, helping people. And so I'll send you a link to that if you ever want to watch an inspirational story. I'll send you a link to his film. It's on YouTube. But I want to thank you for spending about an hour or so speaking about this plenum of things. And it was very informative and very good. So thank you very much for doing so.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Dan. Thanks for having me. You've increased my oxytocin levels.
Well, I aim for it.